love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. I love your voice. You have led me through the fire and darkest nights. You are close like no other. I've known you as a father, and known you as a friend. I have lived in the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I'm surrendered now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I'm surrendered now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me.
Let's sing this together as a prayer.
All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. Yeah. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. Oh, I'm gonna sing of the goodness of God.
Amen. I love the part in that song. It takes a while to get to that part in the song, but I love the part where it says, "You're running after me. You're running after me." You know, we've been in this season of Easter now for the past several weeks. This is the fourth Sunday after Easter. It's hard to believe, but we are already there. And one of the things that keeps happening in so many of the stories after the resurrection is that Jesus is going out to meet the people. I mean, there's a few instances of where Jesus says, I'll meet you somewhere. But it's always, there's the initiative on Jesus' part to go find us, to meet us where we are, to find us on the road, to hook up with us and meet up so that we can continue in this life together. But there's not an example of Jesus saying, come find me. I'll be here sitting on my hands waiting for you until you're ready to come and find me. It's always I'm going to meet you. I will find you. I will pursue you. I will run after you. And I love that about our Christian faith. I think that that's such an important part of what it means to be a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, about somebody who believes that Jesus is actually going to pursue us. Even in some of the wonderful stories that we have, like the story of the prodigal son, the father waits for the son to come home, and there's always that idea that the light is left on for us, that it's never a situation where we're too far gone. There's always the opportunity to find Jesus, to be met by Jesus, to be found on the road again. And that's where we end up with today's story. I'll be reading to you some words that are probably very familiar to you if you have been a Christian for a number of years, and this is a story that traditionally follows Easter Sunday. And so hear now these probably very familiar words to you from Luke's Gospel. I'll be reading from the 24th chapter. This is what happened on the road that day to the place called Emmaus. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all of these things that had happened. And while they were talking and discussing, Jesus came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other as you walk along?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know these things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all people. And how our chief priests and the leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he would be the one who would redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women from our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning. And when they did not find his body there, they came and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who had said, 'He is alive.' Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but we did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going in. But they urged him on strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, he blessed and broke it and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour, they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told them what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in breaking of the bread. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. We've been talking now for the past few weeks since Easter about what next. Where do we go from here? What happens after a big turning point or a major moment in our lives? And we had been focusing for the past 3 Sundays at least on really the same passage of Scripture. We had been reading a story that was talking about the disciples and their apprehension about even leaving the room where they were gathered for fear of what was next. Where were they supposed to go? Where were they led from here? Now that was all in John's gospel, but today we read from Luke's account a little bit different story. We hear about these 2 people who were walking down the road. They're confused, they're sad, their grief is keeping them from maybe even seeing things clearly with what's going on. And we don't have a whole lot of information about this, but they are walking down the road and they are wondering, where do we go from here? And this stranger joins them and they can't recognize that it's Jesus. Now, this has always been a little bit of a hard part for me in this story, and I love this story, but why can't they recognize him? Are they so grief-stricken? Do they have sort of a tunnel vision right now, and they're only focused on where they're going? Are they just sort of wandering aimlessly because they feel like their life had a particular purpose or a course that it was on, and then that all sort of fell away after the crucifixion? Are they wondering about what the women had told them about how the other disciples had gone up to the tomb and seen it empty, and they're bewildered in this and just sort of dumbfounded? I mean, how is it that they don't recognize Jesus? How is it that they're failing to see him? These appearances of Jesus are so important. They're critical to the Christian story because, as I said, they talk about how Jesus comes to meet us. Jesus doesn't wait at the tomb and say, come find me, I'll be here whenever you get around to it. He goes out to the people. He wants to meet them. He wants to engage them where they are. He wants to meet them on the road. But there's also these Jesus appearances that as we continue to read further on into the New Testament, they become fewer and fewer. The distance between Jesus' sightings are now spread more and more apart. And I have to believe that was a difficult thing for the disciples too. I mean, early on, there were some of these sightings of Jesus, or there were messengers and angels that said about Jesus, and go find him, go to Galilee, he's going to be there. Or Jesus meets them on the road like he did these 2 individuals on their way to Emmaus. Or maybe the women who had gone to the tomb, were they greeted by Jesus there, or was it another kind of heavenly messenger? These are questions that we have to be wondering about, but the point is that Jesus was showing up in those moments. But as the days went on, and the days turned to weeks, and the weeks turned to months, the appearances thinned out a lot. And then there was the story of the ascension, where Jesus is no longer with them at all. And the Jesus sightings stopped altogether. Brian McLaren wrote a book a couple of years ago called We Make the Road by Walking. And it's a daily devotional kind of book where you read a short chapter or so every few days. And he tells these stories in many parts as though he is telling it from the perspective of one of the disciples. And I love what he says at this part in the book, because he says, as the disciples, we had this realization, this epiphany moment, that instead of now waiting for Jesus to appear to us, we realized that it was time for Jesus to start appearing in us. We all, as Christians, every one of us as disciples, also has to get to that turning point. We have all of these moments in our lives, hopefully, where it feels like we are especially close to God, where it feels like Christ is walking with us. We've hopefully had those moments where we just felt like we were in one of those very thin places, as some traditions call it, where it feels like God is especially close, or we feel the love of Jesus so powerfully in our life that we say, I can feel it. I just know it. My faith assures me that this is such. And then we get to those other times that after those moments, eventually that powerful kind of sensation does not last forever. And the appearance of Jesus has to be something that instead of looking for that to show up for us, we have to make the appearance of Christ come from us. We have to carry then that message into the world. We have to be servants. We have to continue now our mission to make disciples, to baptize people of all nations, to carry out messages of hope and love and grace to the world, to tell people about Jesus, to serve people who are starving or naked or imprisoned or grieving, and all of the other ways that we seek to be in ministry to others. We stop looking for Christ to appear to us and start thinking about how Christ can appear in us. But even if we get to that place, even when we get to that place, there still comes that point for many of us where we say, but how? How am I going to do that? I mean, after all, we don't all feel totally in our comfort zone when it comes to sharing our faith. We don't always feel like we are most well equipped to, say, hop in a bus with other people and go to another part of the country and help build homes after a storm. Or we don't always feel comfortable getting on a plane and going to a foreign land. And maybe we should. And maybe we should gradually take little steps to get ourselves there. But I would contend that there are actually much more simple ways for us to show signs of Christ appearing within us to other people that Jesus models for us all the time. Take, for example, the story that we just read. Now, I know it was a long scripture passage, but it's an important story, I think, to read from beginning to end, because just taking bits and pieces of it, you miss the fullness of what it's trying to depict to us. Two people walking on the road, grief-stricken. They're hurting, they're struggling. They're walking to a village called Emmaus. And on their way there, they're joined by Jesus. They don't recognize it's him. He says, "What's going on? What's up with you guys?" And they say, "Well, haven't you heard?" I mean, obviously we are hurting. We are suffering deeply right now. Jesus continues to tell the fullness of the story, starting from Moses all the way through the prophets and in now to his life. And he says, you need to believe. They must have been captivated by what he's saying, but then they get to where they're going finally, and they get to a house, and Jesus is going to continue on down the road as if just continuing his ministry. And they say, "No, join us for a meal." And he says, "Okay." And when they sit down, that's when the most special part happens. He blesses the meal, he breaks the bread, and aha, this is the moment. This is him. This is the guy. This is Jesus. Everything that he said now makes sense to us. And he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread, in a meal. Think about that. In a meal. Just sitting down, gathering around the table. There's something sacred about that act. Something powerful happens when we join others around the table. Several years ago now, one of my children was terribly, terribly sick. We were in the pediatric intensive care unit for, just about a month before we were able to bring our child home again. This is such an important story in my family's life, and I don't always talk about it that much because, well, to talk about it in church is to embarrass one of my kids, and quite honestly, I don't want the spotlight on them, so I won't even tell you which child it was, but we had a child who was very sick. And during that time period, we spent every night at the hospital. There were guest rooms adjacent to the PICU, and we had to enter into a little drawing, a little lottery system to see which parents would get to stay in those rooms. And because our child was the sickest in the whole unit for most of that time, we got a room guaranteed almost every night, and the other room was part of a drawing among the other parents. And as we would spend so many hours every day in that unit, we spent that time by our child's bedside, we spent that time in the room that was made up for us each night, and we spent a lot of time in the family waiting area. Now, this wasn't like the general waiting area for the hospital. This was just for parents kind of behind the doors of the pediatric ICU. And that room was a fascinating place. It was like a bus terminal or an airport lobby where it was just sort of a mix, a blend of everybody in society, because everybody gets a sick kid once in a while. And so I looked around the room and I saw some of our neighbors who were of Latinx descent, and then there were others who were Somali, and then there were others who were Laotian, and there were others who were African American, and we would sit there in this lounge, different cultures, different faith traditions, different backgrounds, different languages, and we had the television on. And you know what was on 24 hours a day? Not the news, not reruns of Seinfeld, nothing like that. The Food Network. The Food Network was on 24 hours a day. Everybody could agree on it. Nobody fought over the remote. And everybody found the Food Network to be just rather cathartic. Everybody is in there with stomachs and knots and really heavy hearts and wondering what's going to happen to our children. And it's a gut-wrenching place. But the Food Network was on. Somebody preparing a meal, and whether you understood what they were saying or the Spanish subtitles on the screen, we all knew what was going on the screen. And people would come to visit us from our church, and they would bring us way too much food. And so we would bring in a meal almost every night, and everybody would put on the common table in that waiting room the food that they had to share. And there were forks and paper plates and this global cuisine set out before us every single night. Not that we had a lot of appetite, but you still got to eat. And everybody smiled at each other, broke bread, gathered around the table, and it brought us fellowship, it brought us hope, and that food brought us comfort. Once a week, a whole bunch of pizzas would arrive because there was a family group of families whose kids had made it out of the ICU. And they would contribute to a fund, and every week there was just a standing order for pizzas to be delivered to the families down there. So if it wasn't pizza night, it was everything else, this great buffet. And I realized between what was on the television and what we were doing around the table that gathering and breaking bread has a great, powerful, symbolic value. It brings people from all corners of the planet together. It bridges all of the things that we have already made as the differences among us. And for those moments when we break bread, it seems that things are just okay again. And when we look at so many of the stories in the Bible, look at what Jesus did in his final days before the crucifixion. He met with his disciples in the upper room and he broke bread with them. And he gave it to them and he said, I want you, when you sit down to dinner and when you break the bread, I want you to do this in remembrance of me. I want you to remember this time. I want you to remember this family that we have created. I want you to feel this communion together. And then he passed the cup around to them and he gave it to them and he said, this is my blood given for you. And he said, and I want you to also remember that this is the blood of a new covenant for you and for many, for the forgiveness of sins. And I want you to do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. And so is it any wonder then, after the resurrection, the people are walking down the road, they gather Jesus, they bring him inside, and they sit down at the table with him, and it's all been a mystery to them until they break the bread. And the words echo in their heads, do this in remembrance of me. Every time you do this in remembrance of me. And something sacred happens in that moment. And then Jesus, he goes on to meet his disciples later in Galilee, and they go fishing, and Jesus prepares a lunch on the shore for them. And they're cooking this meal, and Jesus says, come on over. Let's have fish together. Let's break bread together. Let's do this again. And so I think sometimes the what's next for us is something where we take on this idea that we have to have Jesus appear in us to other people. And we have to do this in some sort of mighty, profound way. Like we've got to board a plane to do this, or we've got to take up a special kind of task to do this, or it's going to take a bunch of fundraising to get us to that point. And sometimes it's just as easy as inviting someone else to share a meal, to break bread. Because sometimes to break bread is to break down barriers. Sometimes to break bread is to open the door to a new conversation. Sometimes breaking the bread is the introduction of Jesus Christ to someone else in your life. I'm struck as we've put on these Grace Connect events. You know, we had this whole menu of things to choose from. Everything from, going and doing a breakout room, or going to play Top Golf, or going on a mountain biking trip, or all of these different kinds of things that we had talked about doing. And you know what consistently is the most popular thing if you've gone and signed up? It's the dinners. It's the meals. That's what everybody, pardon the pun, is literally hungry for, is to have meals together. Let's break bread with friends. Let's gather around tables with people that we don't know as well yet. Let's come together at restaurants, in backyards, at dining room tables. Let's reminisce and at the same time make new memories. Let's do this simple thing that keeps showing up in the Gospels. When Jesus wants to share something special with people, he invites them to break bread. Zacchaeus, come down from that tree. I'm going to your house. Let's share a meal. I want you to share a meal with me. When we break bread, I want you to remember me. And all of a sudden, everything that happened on the road was made known to them. Come gather with me on the shore. Let's break bread together. Come after the pandemic, or after you've been vaccinated, or after you feel comfortable, and let's gather in backyards and outdoor restaurants, around dining room tables. Let's break bread. Come, let's kick it up a notch and taste exotic chocolates. These are the things that are the simple things that we can do. It's not a matter of doing something powerfully profound. Sometimes it's as simple as gathering around the table and telling the story and being together again. After a funeral, what does the family do? Shares a meal. After a wedding, what does the family do? We share a meal. What's next? I don't know. But maybe a good place to start is to share a meal. Thanks again for being here with us for worship. We're glad that you joined us for S3. If you'd like to know more about the church, discipleship opportunities, or ways that you can serve, be sure to click on one of the links below. Also, if you're interested in supporting the church beyond your prayers and your presence, we hope that you'll consider giving financially as well, and you can find that link on our page as well. Thank you for being here. Have a great week.